Hello, year 9 and 10. I asked you to have a go at this how useful source question, which is worth 8 marks and should take you about 10 minutes in the exam. In the health and the people paper, you will definitely get one of these, but you'll also use these same primary source skills across all the topics. So I'm just going to take you through how I would do it very quickly, and you can compare that to your answer that you did. Okay, so the first thing that's really important is to look at the question closely. So it's asking you how useful is the source to an historian studying the impact of the Black Death. So in other words, it's saying, well, what's this source telling you about the impact of the Black Death, how it changed England, what it did to England. So let's have a quick look at it, and it's also on your book on page 22. So if I'm looking at this source, this is an illustration, a picture of a 14th century history book written by an abbot recording the impact of the Black Death. It shows people carrying coffins. So my immediate impression of this in terms of the impact is that lots of people died, and we can see that because lots of people are carrying coffins. You wouldn't expect to see that normally, would you? And so there's a dramatic impact on the population as lots of people have died. So for every 1 or 2 people, it looks like there is at least 1 coffin for every 2 people or something like that. So it shows you just the sheer scale and number of people that died. And there are so many, they're having to bury the bodies very, very close together. And look at the expression on their faces. This obviously has a devastating impact on families. So it's a really big social impact on the country. Lots of people have died. Okay, once we've able to say something about what the source is telling us, we can think our next one, C, or the content, and we can use our contextual knowledge to evaluate that content. So in other words, we're saying, what do we know about the Black Death that would explain why this is true? Or maybe why it doesn't tell us. There are some things that it leaves out. But let's focus mainly on what can we do to explain, what knowledge do we have? Well, we can say, can't we, that this is true. The Black Death had a devastating impact on the population, and we know that probably about between a third and a half of the population died as a result of the Black Death during the 14th century. And the chances of dying from it were very, very high if you caught it, and they had no effective treatment. So all of those things meant that the chances of dying were very, very high. And this is really shown quite well. So we can agree with what we're seeing in this source. And we also know, don't we, that they buried people in mass graves because there were so many people. And we know, for example, in Greenwich, in South London, and other places, they've found the evidence of these mass burials. So that's using our contextual knowledge to agree with this. However, we might also say that whilst this shows us very well the devastation of the Black Death, it doesn't really show us maybe the long-term economic consequences. So, for example, the fact that lots of peasants died meant that the peasants that survived were in a much stronger position economically because they could sell their labour at a higher price, and they could move, became more possible to move from place to place to sell their labour as lords needed them to work on their land. So in some ways it sort of began the end of feudalism. So we can think about the fact what it doesn't tell us. Okay, then we think about the provenance, and we'll work with this word origin, S-C-O, O for origin. Well, who made it? Well, it was an abbot. Abbots were important people. This would have been a man who lived in a monastery. Therefore, we can assume that he would have, at the right time in the 14th century, we can assume that he would have seen the things that he is witnessing because of the time he lived. And because maybe as an abbot, he would have been in a monastery where a hospital was attached, so he would have seen the impact of some of this plague. So in that respect, it's good. Purpose. Well, it's a history book, isn't it? And so we can assume that he was writing it to show future generations what had happened. So in that respect, it's a useful source for an historian as well. And of course, it was abbots and monks that recorded history for us, and those are really valuable at the time because those are the people that could read and write. These are just some of the things you might want to say about the provenance. And then overall, I'm going to evaluate it. Well, this is of course a strong source for giving us an impression of the devastation caused by the number of deaths during this period, and the fact that people were really unable to deal with it or understand it or prevent those deaths. But of course it doesn't really go on to explain in the longer term the fact that it changes the nature of England and the way people worked and the power perhaps some of these peasants had. So that's what I would say. Those are some of the things I would think about. I'm going to send you a copy of my answer, which is here, which basically does those things and explains where I've talked about what it says, using my knowledge to explain the content, the provenance, and then my overall evaluation. And there's a little mark scheme up there as well for you to have a look at and compare to your answer. Okay, thank you very much.